Pakistan is surviving on bailouts. At 25% inflation, their cost of living is the highest in Asia. The security situation is precarious, with their one-time proteges, the Taliban, turning against them. And the army has barely managed to steal the election for its chosen party. The short point of this long story is that they have way too many problems. But guess what Pakistani leaders want? Kashmir. It's like they're programmed to keep raising it, even if it makes no sense anymore. This time they've brought it up. They brought up Kashmir with Iran's visiting president. It's part of their joint statement. What should India make of it? We'll discuss that. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State has landed in China and Beijing is flexing its nuclear muscle to welcome him. Washington has cleared a $61 billion aid package for Ukraine. What will it do beyond prolonging the war? What is wealth redistribution? Have countries done it? And how is it done? We'll try to make sense of the latest controversy in the Indian election, an exclusive interview with the president of the World Economic Forum, a status check of the civil war in Myanmar, also how American allies are Trump-proofing themselves, why South Korea is looking to ban iPhones, why non-compete clauses make no sense, how the pro-China leader of the Solomon Islands is on the back foot, and why India is getting its own system to determine shoe sizes. It's called BHER. All this and more coming up. The headlines first. In India, the Supreme Court says electronic voting machines or EVMs cannot be questioned on mere suspicion. It was hearing petitions seeking cross-verification of votes cast using EVMs with a paper audit. The top court has said that the poll body has cleared doubts over EVMs. Iran reduces its military footprint in Syria, withdrawing its forces from the southern part of the country. In recent months, a series of strikes have targeted its commanders in Syria. Tehran has blamed Israel for these attacks. The latest strike prompted Iran to launch its first ever direct attack on Israel. Russia arrests its deputy defense minister over corruption charges. It's a rare move by Moscow amid the offensive in Ukraine. Timur Ivanov is accused of taking bribes. The offense is punishable by a hefty fine or over a decade in prison. Mali's political parties appealed to the Supreme Court asking it to annul the junta's decision to ban them. Over 80 political parties had called for presidential election. In response, the junta had suspended all political activities. Since 2020, Mali has been under military rule. And Italy will now allow pro-life activists into abortion clinics. The decision has sparked outrage among the opposition. Pro-life groups can now have access to women considering abortions at state-funded clinics. In 1978, Italy had legalized abortion. Iran's president was in Pakistan this week. He met top leaders, signed a few deals, spoke to some college students and left this morning. But not without firing a parting shot. A shot possibly aimed at India. Why do I say this? Because Iran and Pakistan have released a joint statement and it talks about Kashmir. Listen to this. Both sides highlighted the need to resolve the issue of Kashmir through dialogue and peaceful means based on the will of the people of that region and in accordance with international law. It's an odd one for India. On Monday, President Ebrahim Raisi held a press conference with Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. Sharif spoke about Kashmir, Raisi did not. He steered clear of the issue. But in the joint statement, Kashmir is back. The question is, how should India see this? Are Pakistan and Iran getting closer? And if so, why? New Delhi has not reacted to the statement yet, but the terminology is noteworthy. There is no mention of dialogue with India. Instead, it talks about the will of the people of Kashmir. Does this signal a change in policy? On paper, maybe not. Let me take you back to 2019. Then Prime Minister Imran Khan visited Iran. He held talks with Raisi's predecessor. Look at the joint statement they issued in Palestine, and Hindus won't covet Kashmir. It's pretty clear where he stood. But after the revolution, Iran toned down this rhetoric. They realized that Pakistan was an American ally, so Tehran warmed up to India. Yet Iranian clerics would occasionally stir the pot, like in 2017. The current supreme leader clubbed Kashmir with Yemen. He said Kashmiris were oppressed by tyrants. So my point is quite simple. Ideologically, Iran has never supported India on the issue of Kashmir. What held them back was geopolitics. They needed India for other things, like for investments in projects, for buying their oil output, and to check US influence in South Asia. But now the equation has changed. India is much closer to the United States of America. It has stopped buying Iranian oil due to sanctions, and the investments are stalled. India and Iran had signed a port deal way back in the year 2003. The plan was to build a terminal at the Chabahar port. But that project has not taken off. So Iran is losing patience. We saw evidence of that earlier this year. India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar visited Tehran. During the talks, Iran talked about compensations, possibly fines for the project delay. So the long-term potential of this relationship has not been realized, which brings us to recent events. India has largely ignored Western sanctions on Russia. We still buy a lot of Russian energy. But with Iran, it's been a different approach. Once the sanctions came on, India stopped buying Iranian oil. That's one recent change. The second is India's response to the conflict in West Asia. First, New Delhi condemned Hamas, which is a proxy of Iran. Then India raised concerns over Iran's strike on Israel. But when Israel hit back, there was no statement from New Delhi. So the India-Iran equation has changed. Same with the Pakistan-Iran equation. Pakistan shares a border with three countries: Iran, Afghanistan, and India. It has major issues with India and Afghanistan, so Islamabad is keen on fixing things with the remaining neighbor, which is Iran. Also, Pakistan's iron brother China is a close ally of Tehran, not to mention a rival of India's. Now, all of this makes one thing quite clear: the geopolitical equation has changed. It is not the same as the 1990s or 2000s. The question is, are we looking at a possible realignment? I'm afraid it's too early to say, because one meeting and one joint statement changes nothing. But that's also no reason to ignore Iran. For decades, New Delhi has balanced this relationship well. You had great ties with Arab nations. You also had great ties with Iran, something very few countries have managed. And that gives India strategic depth in West Asia. It's important to preserve and build that. Speaking of strategic depth, the US is struggling on this front when it comes to China. So they've dispatched their latest emissary to manage ties. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he's visiting China this week. It's a 3-day trip. It has 2 stops, Beijing and Shanghai. He may have a meeting with President Xi Jinping, although it won't be a pleasant conversation because China is ready with a long list of complaints, and it starts with Taiwan. Listen to this.
We resolutely oppose it. We urge the United States to take concrete actions to honor its commitment and to not support Taiwan's independence and to stop arming Taiwan in any way.
What is China protesting about? A spending bill that US lawmakers have passed. It was passed just before Blinken landed in China. And what does the bill say? The US is giving military aid to Taiwan, $8 billion of it. Obviously, Beijing does not like that. Then there is TikTok, the Chinese app. Washington may ban it. And they're also threatening to sanction Chinese banks over their business ties with Russia. So a lot of flashpoints. Blinken is set to face the proverbial firing squad. China's tone is combative and aggressive. 2 days ago, before Blinken's arrival, they released their power. This video features a Chinese nuclear submarine firing a ballistic missile on the high seas. And what kind of missile is this? It's called the JL-2. China unveiled it in the year 2019, and the US sees it as a threat because of its range. If deployed at the right location in the Pacific, this Chinese missile can target the US. It can target the entire western half of America, including high-profile targets like Hawaii and Alaska. Now, we do not know if this was a recent test or if China is just using an old video here, but the message they're trying to convey is quite clear. China is reminding America about its strike capabilities. Blinken may have seen this coming because earlier this week, he had a message of his own.
When it comes to Russia's defense industrial base, the primary contributor in this moment to that is China. We see China sharing machine tools, semiconductors, other dual-use items that have helped Russia rebuild the defense industrial base that...
You see the argument that he's putting forth. China is helping Russia fight the war in Ukraine, and that is America's charge. And he plans to bring it up during this visit. What else is on the agenda? China's military activities, particularly the drills near Taiwan and the South China Sea. Blinken plans to raise both issues when he meets his counterpart Wang Yi on Friday. Reports say this meeting could last for up to 6 hours. And in the run-up to the meeting, both sides are talking at each other, so do not expect a positive outcome, let alone a breakthrough, which has been the case for the better part of the last 3 years, because for any diplomatic initiative to succeed, you need some common ground. But when it comes to the US and China, there is little that they agree on. On key issues, they have major differences. In the Indo-Pacific, for example, the US and China are on opposite sides. On trade, China accuses America of slapping restrictions, while America complains about Chinese oversupply. And this is impacting the overall relationship. Let me show you a survey that came out last year. It featured American companies. They were asked about US-China ties. 46% of these companies said the relationship will deteriorate. And they were right. American investments in China are shrinking. And there's little to suggest that things will look up anytime soon, especially with the US presidential election approaching. There's going to be more rhetoric and hardening of positions to suit political purposes. Both Democrats and Republicans want to look tough on China. Biden faces a difficult rematch against Donald Trump, and Trump is a known China hawk. Biden cannot afford to look soft or appease China at this stage, so expect more tough talk. The US president likes to say that America and China are competing with each other. But from the looks of it, the competition has turned into confrontation, and no side can afford to pull their punches now. For our next story, imagine this situation. You're drowning. Your breath is running out, you feel like your lungs will give up, and suddenly someone tosses a life buoy to you. What would you do? Grasp it with all your strength. It may or may not save you, but it does offer some relief. And that's Ukraine right now. It's been struggling for months. Russia has battered its front lines. Cities have fallen, morale has crashed, and finally there's a lifeline, a $61 billion aid package from the United States.
This national security bill is one of the most important measures Congress has passed in a very long time to protect America's security and the security of Western democracy. To our friends in Ukraine, America will soon deliver more ammunition and air defenses and basic supplies you need to resist Putin on the battlefield.
This bill had been stalled for quite some time. Democrats and Republicans were divided, but it looks like they've gotten over their differences. The US Senate has finally passed the bill, and US President Joe Biden has also signed it. He says Ukraine has the will and the skill to win this war.
It's going to make America safer, it's going to make the world safer, and it continues America's leadership in the world, and everyone knows it. Ukraine has regained over half the territory Russia took from them in this invasion. And they won important victories against Russia's Navy. But make no mistake about it, they're a fighting force with the will and the skill to win. And now, America's going to send Ukraine the supplies they need to keep them in the fight.
This news was, of course, met with a big sigh of relief in Kiev. They've been waiting for this for almost 6 months, during which time they've lost both men and land. President Volodymyr Zelensky has expressed gratitude. He says this money will save lives. But will it really? Can this aid package help turn the tide, or will it just prolong the war? Before we answer that, let's look at the ground situation. It's day 790 of this war, 790 days. This is the current map of Ukraine. The areas marked in red are under Russian control. Since October last year, Ukraine has lost 583 square kilometers of territory. That's in the country's east. In February, Moscow captured the city of Avdiivka, and now there's a fight for Chasiv Yar. Ukraine says Russia wants to capture this town by the 9th of May. Why the 9th of May? Because that's when Moscow celebrates Soviet Victory Day. Meanwhile, Ukrainian soldiers are outnumbered. Russia has more troops. It also has more ammunition. According to Ukraine, for every 1 shell that they fire, Russia fires at least 6, which makes this a losing battle for them. So will this American aid make a meaningful difference for Ukraine? Now, Biden has signed the bill. The Pentagon is going to need a few days. It has some supplies in storage sites in Europe, like artillery shells. Those will be mobilized first. But what Kiev really wants are air defense systems. They want long-range missiles to challenge Russian air superiority and slow the advance of troops. And all of this also comes with added pressure.
I left a message for President Zelensky tonight. He had called me the other day and said, okay, we got it done. Now go win the fight.
Since the war began, the US has given Ukraine more than $75 billion in aid, and now it's sending another $61 billion. Do the math. That's a lot of money. 75 plus $61 billion. Obviously, America wants to see results. But it won't be easy for Ukraine. They can make some gains in the battlefield. They can even stall some Russian advances. But winning the war is a tall ask. $61 billion may give them much needed support, but they're going to need a lot more than money. Soldiers, for instance. Ukraine is struggling to recruit soldiers. It has now suspended consular services for Ukrainian men. This is to drive up military recruitment. Basically, Ukrainian men abroad will not have access to consular services. They will only be issued documents to return home. Of course, it's a highly unpopular decision, but Ukraine doesn't seem to care anymore. They need more men on the battlefield. They've got the money, but it's unlikely to change very much. More men and more aid will only prolong the battle because at the end of the day, this is a war of attrition. The country that lasts longer wins the war. India's election has a new flashpoint: wealth redistribution. Looks like everyone is talking about it. The Prime Minister, opposition leaders and political commentators. It all started with Prime Minister Modi's comments last weekend. He said the Congress party would snatch away people's land and gold if elected. Sort of like a Robin Hood scheme. Take from the rich and give to the poor. So obviously, there's a lot of confusion and fear. And the Congress party has not helped its case. One of their leaders, Sam Pitroda, waded into the controversy. He suggested that inheritance tax could be a good way to distribute wealth. Listen to this.
Let me tell you, in America, there is an inheritance tax. So if, let's say, one has $100 million worth of wealth, and when he dies, he can only transfer probably 45% to his children. 55% is grabbed by government. Now, that's an interesting law.
Interesting indeed. It hasn't helped them. What exactly is this inheritance tax? It is not levied across the US. Only 6 American states have this particular tax. Say your relative dies and you inherit their assets. You must pay a tax on it. The rate may vary from state to state. It's just 1% in some states, but it can go up to 20% in others. Even India had a version of this tax. It was called the estate duty. But in 1985, the government of India abolished it. The idea was to simplify taxes. Now, the Congress party says it is not looking to reintroduce this tax. Even Sam Pitroda has walked back on his statement. But the damage has been done. The BJP has latched onto these remarks and the Prime Minister is leading the charge.
अब कांग्रेस का कहना है कि वो इनहेरिटेंस टैक्स लगाएगी, माता पिता से मिलने वाली विरासत पर भी टैक्स लगाएगी। कांग्रेस का मंत्र है कांग्रेस की लूट जिंदगी के।
Forget inheritance tax. Let's focus on wealth redistribution. Specifically on 4 questions. Why is it done? Have other countries done it? Does it actually help? And what is the Congress party's plan? Now, the why is pretty simple. Wealth is redistributed to address inequalities. India is among the most unequal countries in the world. The top 1% of the population in India holds 40% of the wealth, 40. 1% holds 40% of the wealth. So the goal is to bridge that gap, to spread the wealth more equitably. Which brings us to the next question. How have countries actually done this? Well, some have taken the extreme route, like the Soviet Union. After the revolution of 1917, rich people became enemy number 1 in Soviet Russia. They lost their homes, land and money. Some of them also lost their lives. The Soviets took over most private land and enterprises, and China tried something similar. After the revolution, the Communist Party of China redistributed land. Around 40 million hectares were taken away, and this land, 40 million hectares, was given to over 300 million people in China. In fact, even India has tried this out. After independence, landlords dominated rural India. They owned most of the land. The people who cultivated this land had no rights. So the government introduced land reforms. Limits were placed on how much land a person or family could own, and the excess was redistributed. But those were different times. The society and the economy had a colonial legacy. Today, redistribution happens very differently. It happens mainly via taxes. In the US, for instance, there is a chorus to tax the super rich. That's actually a form of redistribution. Take more money from the rich, give it indirectly to people who need it, maybe through subsidies or loan waivers. And here in India, we have a system of progressive taxes. More income equals more taxes. Again, this is redistribution, but on a small scale. Countries in the Nordic have perfected this. They have among the highest tax rates in the world. They also have the least inequality, the Nordic countries. Which brings us to the third question. Does it actually work? Well, economists are divided. Some say billionaires should pay more. India had just one billionaire in 1991. It had more than 162 billionaires in 2022. So the argument is the super rich should pay more taxes. But others disagree. They say more taxes discourage growth. The super rich may ask, what's the point of investing money? If you make more profits, you will pay more tax, meaning there is no incentive to invest. The question is, which side is right? Honestly, it's hard to say. A balance between the two would be ideal, and that's our final question. What is the Congress Party's plan really? There is not much clarity yet. Party leader Rahul Gandhi outlined this idea first. He said the Congress Party will do a nationwide financial survey. For what? What will that survey find? How much wealth each family or group has. And based on this, assets will be distributed. Now you can see why this is confusing. It may not mean snatching away someone's gold or land, but it does raise questions. Where will this wealth come from? Is it a reference to government subsidies, or unused government land, or public resources, or income tax? Only a thorough clarification can settle this controversy. Meanwhile, globally, the focus is on India's economic policies. India is the world's fastest growing economy. The IMF says it could become the third largest economy by 2027. And this is despite 2 wars, multiple conflicts, and global economic gloom and doom. So the question is, how has India managed to remain the bright spot? How is it defying these trends? What will be the impact of rising global debt and artificial intelligence? Today, I spoke to Borje Brent, the president of the World Economic Forum. Here's an excerpt of that conversation. Mr. Brent, welcome to First Post, and thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
We are living in a world with 2 major conflicts, 2 major wars rather, and multiple other conflicts and deepening divisions. First of all, what impact do you see on the global economy in the year ahead?
So the global economy is doing much better than we expected. So we were afraid that we're going to be faced with a recession this year, and we do now expect the global economy to then grow more than 3%. What we are faced with instead is kind of a global geopolitical recession, and we do hope that those conflicts that you were mentioning, Ukraine, Gaza conflict, doesn't then escalate in a way where they will also have severe negative impact on trade and growth.
How do you think India is faring in this larger global environment, and what is your assessment of India's growth story and trajectory?
So India is also an economy that, of course, relies on other countries and the global situation. But since growth is back, even if it's lower than trend growth in the last 3 decades, trend growth was close to 4%. Now we are a little bit more than 3%. India is doing incredibly well. I have to say that India is the fastest growing of the large economies in the world. If India continues with its reforms, I think India in the coming decade can become a $10 trillion economy. And what does that mean? It means that India will be the third largest economy in the world, and it means that more people get opportunities for jobs and a better livelihood. We should not forget that India has, due to this growth that we have also seen the last years, eradicated poverty at an impressive scale. 400 million people has been lifted out of extreme poverty. This has only been seen in China at that pace in the past.
And India is a democracy, so with all the compulsions or the trappings of a democracy, to be able to achieve this is interesting. And this 10 trillion figure is something that you have mentioned in the past as well. You've said that India is on track to becoming a $10 trillion economy in the coming years. What is the X factor that you see in the Indian economic landscape? Why is it able to buck the global trend of slowdowns? Is it the policy decisions? Is it larger geopolitical forces? Or is it a combination of the two?
All the above, I would say. The reforms have been important. We're seeing that infrastructure is changing very fast in India, hundreds of new airports. We're also seeing trains and roads. We are also seeing that the Indian economy is opening up, more open to foreign direct investments, more level playing field. Of course, also India has benefited from this diversification of value chains. Many countries say they cannot have just 80-90% of products being manufactured in one country. And you also have this so-called friend-shoring that India is benefiting from, especially, I think, the largest economy in the world, the US, also are now increasing manufacturing coming from India. Just look at Apple. There's not a lot of Apple iPhones produced in India just a few years ago. I know it's like 25% of their production. And I would also add that we're seeing stronger growth in services and the digital economy than the traditional manufacturing. And India is stronger on services and digital. So also the fact that India has quite digitally literate population, especially the young, is working in its interest. And also, of course, this digital ID was important in this broader context.
So from a policy perspective, what would your prescription for New Delhi be? More of the same?
More of the same. I would also make sure that the revenues that will come from a growth of 8% are invested in areas where it further increases India's competitiveness in the future.
In fact, global agencies like the IMF and the World Bank have also been raising the concerns over rising levels of debt, especially in the developing world. What sort of risk do you think this unsustainable debt poses to the global economy?
The problem is that when the growth is pretty low, to go into an austerity situation now would also not be a good thing, because we still have to support growth. But the interest rates are also high because of the inflationary pressure that is there. A lot of this debt was taken and committed in a situation where there were zero interest. And when you now have 4% interest, interest rates has now become the largest budget cost in many developing countries. And this is very worrisome. These money should have been invested then in school, education, and health and infrastructure.
Mr. Borhe-Brend, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Don't forget to catch the full conversation, the entire interview on our website and YouTube channel. Vantage continues after a short break.
Seen leaders members of Congress party giving out clarification as to, when they have written something like that in their manifesto, what it actually means.
Let me now go across to a renowned economist and former executive director with the International Monetary Fund. Dr. Sujit Basu is now joining us. Thank you very much, Dr. Basu, for speaking with us. So this whole idea of inheritance tax, which has been floated by Mr. Petroda, first of all, he says it's there in the United States. He calls it an interesting idea. It's there in just all of 6 states out of 50 in the United States. Why do you believe that this is a bad idea? India's had inheritance tax in the past. Why did we abolish it?
We have had lots of bad ideas in the past, and we have abolished several of those bad ideas. Some of them are still continuing. So just because we had an inheritance tax in the past doesn't mean it should be applicable to it. More to the point, look, everybody's entitled to their opinion, but we are in the stage of development where we should be celebrating the generation of wealth, the generation of jobs.
Let me now go across to a renowned economist and former executive director with the International Monetary Fund. Dr. Sujit Basu is now joining us. Thank you very much, Dr. Basu, for speaking with us. So this whole idea of inheritance tax.
For the moment, we'll talk about Donald Trump. He's contesting the presidential election on a Republican ticket, it's all but certain. So before this time next year, he could be back in the White House. And the very prospect has left US allies spooked. They're not waiting for the election or the results. They're Trump-proofing themselves. What does that mean? They're working on contingency plans. Some of them are trying to woo Republicans and the inner circle of Donald Trump. Others are resorting to legislative measures, just unpredictable policy changes. But will these preparations help in managing a Trump White House? Our next report tells you.
There's a famous photograph from 2018. It features Donald Trump with top world leaders. There's Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron staring down Trump. Shinzo Abe was there too, standing with his folded hands with a resigned look on his face. For many observers, this picture still serves as a reminder of the challenging and turbulent Trump years, which were marked by difficult negotiations and frustration among world leaders over Trump's America First policies. In 2019, a hot mic moment captured how some leaders felt about engaging with Trump. They were all taken aback by Trump's unpredictable leadership style. This time around, they're not taking any chances. Come November, Trump will be on the ballot again. If he wins, European allies like Germany want to be better prepared. Reports say the Germans are reaching out to Republicans, especially the Trump supporters, on the state level. What is Berlin worried about? Trump's idea of placing a 10% tariff on all kinds of imports. If Trump becomes president and goes ahead with this plan, it could hurt one of Germany's biggest exports. German automobiles like cars. So Germany is hoping some pressure from the grassroots may help in changing Trump's mind. Allies like Japan are opting for a more direct outreach. Earlier this week, the Trump Tower in New York received a visitor. It was former Japanese Prime Minister Taro Aso.
Well, he's a highly respected man in Japan and beyond, and somebody that I've liked and I've known through our very dear friend, right, Shinzo. We love Shinzo. Yes. And who was a great man, by the way. He was a great, great man. But we got to know each other, we like each other, and we'll be talking about Japan and the United States right now, and lots of other things also. But highly respected. It's a great honor to have him.
What is your message to the Japanese people?
To the people of Japan?
Yes.
It's a great country. You're doing very well.
This engagement would have reassured Tokyo. But the Japanese aren't leaving anything to chance. Reports say they have plans to deploy Sunao Takao, an interpreter who worked with Shinzo Abe. Sunao is said to have helped the former Prime Minister develop a relationship with Trump. What will his new assignment look like? Sunao Takao could be mobilized to build more bridges between the Trump camp and Tokyo. More leaders have held direct engagements with Trump recently, like Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, Poland's President Andrzej Duda, and British Foreign Secretary David Cameron.
On the issue of my meeting with President Trump, this was entirely in line with precedent of government ministers meeting with opposition politicians in the run-up to elections.
So, while some are working to rekindle old ties, Canberra is mulling legal protection. Australian officials are pushing for a legislation. It could legally guarantee AUKUS, Australia's military alliance with the UK and the US. Trump's victory in 2016 had come as a shock to many. But this time, American allies around the world seem to have begun their homework, even though Trump is still just a presumptive nominee.
Now let's turn to Myanmar. It has been in a state of civil war for months. On one side is the military junta, on the other are various anti-junta groups, at least 10 of them. They have various motivations and allegiances, but one thing in common. They all want to defeat Myanmar's military junta. And today they faced a setback. The junta secured a small victory. They recaptured a town they had recently lost. It's called Myawaddy, located at the Myanmar-Thailand border. It's a crucial trade hub, this town, connecting Thailand to southern Myanmar. Myawaddy was captured by anti-junta forces on the 10th of April by a group called the Karen National Liberation Army. Now, this is one of the 10-odd anti-junta factions. But now this group has been forced to retreat. So does this mean that the junta is winning? Will they solidify their grip on the country? Not really, because when you look at the big picture, this looks like a small win. Let me explain. The junta grabbed power in the year 2021 by ousting the democratically elected government of Myanmar, and since then the junta has been in charge, at least in the central provinces, the big cities. But they never really controlled the entire country, even in 2021. Let me show you this map. These are the regions and states of Myanmar. The ones in blue are home to the majority population, the Bamar people. They make up almost 70% of Myanmar's population. The blue regions are Bamar majority areas, and that is where the junta exercises most control, its power base. Now look at the other areas. In red, these parts of Myanmar are home to ethnic minorities. The states are even named after the minority communities, like Rakhine and Chin on the west, Kachin up north, Shan, Kain and Kaya in the east, and Mon down south. Now, these 7 states are home to 7 different minority communities, and the junta has always struggled to control them. The various ethnic groups began the present phase of resistance. Hostilities broke out in the Shan state. They began on the 27th of October last year. 3 minority groups rose up against the junta, and they pushed the military out of some strategic enclaves at the Myanmar-China border. The junta was pushed out. Their success started a chain reaction. Other ethnic minority groups joined the fighting. Each group has its own militia, and they've been fighting in their home state since. These militias are nominally aligned, but it's not some grand liberation army. Everyone has their own agenda. What brings them together is just one thing, a common enemy, and that is the Myanmar junta. Now, since the fighting began in October, the junta has been facing enemies on all sides, in all these ethnically diverse states. But that's not all. They're also being challenged in the Bamar heartland. Inside their power base, they're facing challenges not by minorities, but by the majority Bamar people. People who want a return of democracy, forces aligned with the previous government. They call themselves the People's Defense Force. So to recap, Myanmar's 7 ethnic minority-run states are up in arms, and people loyal to the ousted democratic government are also fighting. They're all trying to defeat the junta, which is why the military is on the back foot. which is also why recapturing one town, however important, is just a small victory. The junta is still surrounded. A victory on one side is usually followed by a loss on the other, which happened today as well. The junta lost another outpost in the north, in the Kachin state. So they're being pushed back into their strongholds. They've lost control of the border regions. And that is the present situation. That is the big picture in Myanmar. The question is, what happens next? Where does Myanmar go from here? The ethnic minority states are in disarray. About 3 million people have been displaced because of the fighting. Thousands have fled to neighboring countries. Those left behind live in makeshift camps with no proper food, health care or educational services. If the junta wins, will it look after all these people? Will it protect the Bamar people who fought against it? If not, then Myanmar's future looks bleak, like a never-ending cycle of revenge. When it rains, it pours. Ask Apple. They're facing one challenge after another. The latest one has come from South Korea. They may ban iPhones for their military. Why? Because of security concerns. Meanwhile, in China, iPhone sales have plunged. They're down by almost 20%. Last year, Apple topped smartphone sales in China, but this year, it's at the third position. Can the company reverse this trend? Will a ban in South Korea and dipping sales in China force Apple to change strategy? And what will that strategy look like? Our next report tells you.
South Korea has a new problem. For once, it's not the country's northern neighbor, but it's the iPhone. South Korea's military wants to ban it. It wants to restrict the use of the device in security buildings. Why? Because of security concerns. At the center of this is an app. It's the National Defense Mobile Security app. All military devices must have this app. What does it do? It restricts the capabilities of a smartphone. Basically, the camera, the Wi-Fi and the microphone are restricted. This is to prevent any leaks. But when it comes to the iPhone, this app faces a hurdle. Apple has strict privacy controls. It prevents third-party apps from restricting iPhone functions. So this security app cannot disable the microphone or Wi-Fi. It can only disable the camera. Meanwhile, in Android phones, the security app can fully control the hardware, so it can disable everything, which is why South Korea's military is now leaning towards Android. Reports refer to an internal Air Force document. It says bringing iPhones to work will be banned from June 1st. However, if you have an Android, like a Samsung Galaxy, you can walk in with that. The ban can impact nearly 500,000 military personnel. This is across the Army, Navy and Air Force. Some reports say trial runs have already begun, so it doesn't look too good for Apple. But this isn't the company's only problem. It's having a bad time in China as well. iPhone sales have plunged by nearly 20% during the January to March quarter. This is the company's worst performance in China since 2020. Last year, Apple topped smartphone sales in fourth quarter, but this year it ranked third, after Vivo and Honor. So what explains these dipping sales? China is Apple's biggest overseas market, yet it faces multiple hurdles. One is the ban on foreign devices in state-backed firms. That has impacted Apple. And two, it's losing market share to its Chinese rival, Huawei. Huawei has released its new flagship handset, and that is giving strong competition to Apple. Apple's market share has fallen from over 19% to 15.7% in the first quarter. Meanwhile, Huawei has seen a rise in sales, with a 15.5% market share in the first quarter. This year, it could lead smartphone sales in the country. All of this doesn't bode too well for Apple, but the company is trying to bounce back. Last month, it launched its 8th store in Shanghai. It will be the largest in the country. Tim Cook arrived in the city himself to celebrate the store's opening. So clearly, the company is pushing hard. But Apple is yet to figure out a way to skirt around bans in state-backed and military devices.
Who decides where you work? Normally you do. People have the right to choose where and for whom they work, but not all the time. In some cases, a contract could handicap you. It's called a non-compete. Say you work for a company called X. They have asked you to sign a non-compete. So when you leave this job, your options are limited. It may prevent you from working for a competitor or starting a rival company or even working in the same region. It's a major flashpoint between workers and companies. Workers say it's unnecessary, but companies swear by it. So now American regulators have stepped in. That's the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. They have banned non-compete agreements in the United States. This move was first proposed in January, and now it has been passed. So what will this ban change on the ground? It is retroactive in nature, so all existing non-competes will automatically be cancelled, and new ones, of course, are illegal. And is anyone exempt? Well, the FTC does not cover certain industries like non-profits, airlines, and some banks. So the order will not apply there. Plus, it will not include contracts signed by senior executives like your CEOs and CFOs. Other than that, everyone is included. And the workers are quite happy. All the trade and workers' unions have hailed this ban, but businesses are not happy. America's largest business lobby has already sued the FTC, the regulator. They say the regulator does not have this power, only the US Congress does. So the ban must be revoked. That's what businesses say. But forget the looming legal showdown. Focus on the motive behind this ban. It's high time employees got this right. Studies show that you spend 1/3 of your life at work, which is almost 90,000 hours on average for each person, 90,000 hours at work. So where you work impacts a lot of things, your mental health, your work-life balance, and your personal happiness. How can anyone limit or curb that choice? Also, don't forget the monetary benefits. Non-competes reduce your job opportunities. Over time, it can affect your income. In fact, the US regulator has published some numbers. Banning non-competes will increase earnings by $524. That's increase per year, more than $500. It could also unleash economic potential. A lot of entrepreneurs are limited by non-competes. They may have an excellent business idea, but the contract prevents them from starting it. Again, there are numbers. The American regulator says 8,500 new startups can be created every year by banning non-competes. So the economic potential is evident. Then why do companies support it? Why do they emphasize on non-competes? For starters, they stand to lose nothing. Just stick a non-compete within the contract agreement. Chances are most people will sign it, either out of fear or necessity, or even ignorance. So their attitude is, the company's attitude is, why not? But that's not the main reason. The main reason is to protect trade secrets. Employees may have access to important information, maybe an algorithm or a food recipe or a business tactic. What if employees reveal this secret to a rival? That is what most companies say. But there are two problems with this argument. Number one, how many employees actually have access to trade secrets? Maybe a handful or a dozen. But the non-competes are applied everywhere. Just take the US. Around 30 million workers are subject to non-competes. Do all of them have access to trade secrets? And if they do, it is not a secret anymore. And the second point, why not sign a non-disclosure agreement instead? This stops employees from sharing information, but it does not curb their right to work. So my point is quite simple. Non-competes are not a necessity. In some cases, they're not even legal. Take India, for example. Here, non-competes only apply during your job stint. Say, if you're working for company X, you cannot work for its rival at the same time, which is quite reasonable. But once you quit, you're free to join them. You quit one company and join another. The non-compete does not apply. The problem is, a lot of workers do not know this, especially freshers. Indian IT companies are notorious for such contracts. The likes of TCS, Infosys, Wipro, they make you sign them. So a ban alone may not be enough. Awareness is equally important, and this goes beyond just non-competes. As workers, you're entitled to a host of rights on working hours, on benefits, and on wages. It is important that you know about those rights, because don't expect companies to tell you about them. Now, speaking of competition, let's look at geopolitical contests, fights for influence in a remote battleground, the Solomon Islands. The Solomon Islands went to polls last week. We told you about this on the show, about how China was on the ballot there because their elections were partly about that, about China's growing influence on the islands. Well, the people have voted, and a sizable number seem to have rejected Beijing. The pro-China Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare is on the back foot. He barely held on to the constituency, his own constituency, and he doesn't have the numbers to return to power. Here's our report.
The Solomon Islands held their general election last week, on April 17th. The election was closely watched by countries around the world because it was seen as a referendum on China. The Solomon Islands is an independent nation located in the Pacific Ocean, close to Australia. Australia has traditionally been their closest ally and partner, but that changed in the last few years. All thanks to this man, Manasseh Sogavare. Sogavare became Prime Minister in April 2019, and he spent his tenure changing his country's diplomatic policy. In September 2019, just months after taking power, he made his first big move. He severed diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Instead, he chose to ally himself with Beijing. That's when China started making inroads in the Solomon Islands. It culminated with a security pact in 2022. A secret pact which gives China unknown levels of influence in the Solomon Islands. Last week's election was the first since this shift in policy, so it was seen as a litmus test. A test of China's and the pro-China Sogavare's popularity. The result has been a mixed bag. Sogavare has not returned as Prime Minister, well, not yet anyway. His party didn't win enough seats for that. In fact, he barely retained his own constituency. That too by the narrowest of margins. These are Sogavare's own words. He said this in an interview with a local news outlet. But despite the close call, Sogavare is defiant. He says the result is a blow to the West, which means it's also a victory for his backers in Beijing. It seems China avoided an embarrassing defeat in the Solomon Islands. Their candidate has narrowly survived the election. And even though he didn't manage a clear win, Sogavare didn't exactly lose the election either. Sogavare leads the Ownership, Unity and Responsibility Party, shortened as the Our Party. It has emerged as the single largest party after the polls. It won 15 of the country's 50 parliamentary seats, well short of the 26 needed for a majority. But more than the competition. The major opposition coalition won just 12 seats. Everyone else was in single digits, which means Sogavare is the closest to forming a government, provided he can cobble together his own coalition. And this brings us to a prominent factor in the politics of the Solomon Islands. Independent candidates. 11 independents won during these elections. That means 11 seats are up for grabs. These independents will be wooed and cajoled by the bigger parties. Any of them could become a kingmaker or maybe even a king. After all, Sogavare won his last prime ministership that way. He was an independent who was chosen to become the prime minister. Only after that did he form the OUR party. So don't be surprised if something similar happens again. But it's still a long shot. Sogavare doesn't seem keen on giving up power. He has announced that he still runs the security apparatus of the island nation. Sogavare says that until a successor is chosen, he is very much in charge. He has the power of the government behind him. He also has China's backing. Horse trading is common in the Solomon Islands, which means Sogavare might just return. But even if he does, his position has been weakened. The people of the Solomon Islands have shown that they are wary of him and by extension, wary of China.
Vantage continues after a short break.
Let me now go across to a renowned economist and former executive director with the International Monetary Fund. Dr. Sujit Basu is now joining us. Thank you very much, Dr. Basu, for speaking with us. So this whole idea of inheritance tax, which has been floated by Mr. Petroda. First of all, he says it's there in the United States. He calls it an interesting idea. It's there in just all of 6 states out of 50 in the United States. Why do you believe that this is a bad idea? India has had inheritance tax in the past. Why did we abolish it?
We have had lots of bad ideas in the past, and we have abolished several of those bad ideas. Some of them are still continuing. So just because we had an inheritance tax in the past doesn't mean it should be applicable today. More to the point, look, everybody's entitled to their opinion, but we are in the stage of development where we should be celebrating the generation of wealth, the generation of jobs, the economy moving forward.
And now it's time for Vantage Chart's images that tell the story. In London, blood-covered military horses ran loose on the streets after they escaped during a royal rehearsal. In Peru, a police helicopter rescued a man from a burning building. And skies over southern Greece turned orange due to a Saharan dust storm. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1955, the Bandung Conference came to an end in Indonesia. It was a meeting of 29 countries of the global south, most of them newly independent. This conference condemned the growing camp politics of the Cold War. It led to the foundation of the non-aligned movement. We're leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Infrastructure partner बनेगा तो बढ़ेगा इंडिया. Ultratech, India's #1 cement. Co-powered by AC for Smart Homes. Berger Paints, 100 years of trust. In association with SP160, Plate Boom.
Namaste, Jai Hind and welcome ladies and gentlemen. If there is heaven on earth, it is here, it is here, it is here, and there is a reason why. We come to you from the Union Territory of Jammu Kashmir.